Hey, hello everyone. Welcome one and all to our panel on called "You Reveal Your Tragic Backstory." What's next? I'm Ammourazz, and with me is Morgan. You want to introduce yourself?
Yeah, I'm Morgan. I design games at nestedgames.itch.io, and uh, I play a lot of role-playing games, and so have some experience on this topic. What
Hey,
about you?
what about me? Uh, so I'm Ammourazz. I use they them pronouns. I am a designer, podcaster, player, just random person on the internet. I've done this introduction a bunch of times, and it does not get any more cohesive, but that's fine. It
Never.
doesn't have to be. Yeah. So that out of the way, there's no one else to introduce because today it is just us. This panel is going to be a little bit different than the other panels that Michael and Morgan and I have been on. If you've seen our other panels, uh, that have had more people on them, and it's been more kind of a formal, structured panel. I thought those were really cool. You should check out our other panel that we did yesterday on. Honesty in GMing and being open about improv styles. It's really cool, and it's a complementary panel to this one from the focus on like being a GM in this style of play. And that one was really structured because there were like five or six of us and we were going through that. This one is just us, so it's probably going to be a lot more conversational.
Yeah,
We're
you
just
can
gonna.
find that panel at the Broadswords Twitch channel.
That's right. That's where it was. I think it should be available there on VOD. It's a really fun panel in my opinion. The other panelists were phenomenal as well. So definitely worth your time. Uh, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So with that out of the way, we're just gonna start right into it. So the purpose of this panel is to talk about a form of being like. Let me let me start that over. For me, one of the things that is most important in playing games is kind of constructing a story, and to do that, I found that it's a lot easier to be open about all the elements of the story that you know or want to be included with the other players rather than hold them close and try to create an element of surprise. Now, obviously, different people want different experiences and can, as long as everyone in the group is cool with that, that works perfectly fine. But this panel is going to be specifically talking about that. Do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I think the other thing to add is so for one thing, it's definitely playing with all your cards out on the table in regard to like just character information. But also, I think it's this a second aspect to it is just playing your most interesting cards right away and just letting and dealing with the fallout afterward, which I think is something that people are not always depending on your style, you may like this or you prefer slow burns, but really we're gonna focus on this style just because people don't talk about it as much. And I really like doing this.
Yeah,
Just dropping like my big backstory card session one. Let's do it and let's deal with the consequences.
yeah. Uh, so I guess let's start by talking like, what's the first time that you kind of started using that approach, if you can think of it?
First time. Um
Because, like, for me at least, I remember a lot earlier on where I would do kind of more what is sort of expected in gameplay of like keeping certain things close to the chest to drop them for dramatic moments. And then there was kind of a moment where a player approached me about like, hey, are you cool with us going in this direction with our characters? And when that happened, I was like, yeah, I mean that's kind of what I wanted to do. And when we talked about it, we were able to make it happen more effectively than if we just kind of tried to let it happen. I don't know.
Yeah, I think for me, it's like a lot more intuitive in the sense of maybe role playing itself wasn't intuitive to me, so it took a while to adjust to actually like do that well. But once I started doing it, I started doing this technique.
Mhm.
Um, Probably because at the same time, I just had a similar thought going through my head of like sort of the writing advice of don't save all your big ideas, just like throw them out now
Yeah.
because why wait? And I think that was just flowing in my head when I just started rolling in. So it's probably especially 'cause I haven't
Yep.
been role playing all that long. So for me, it's a lot more of a recent thing.
Yeah.
Um,
I
I
think
can
like
think of early times. Oh, you go.
if you get married to the one big idea and you keep trying to build it up, you don't leave room for other ideas to grow. Like if you were creative enough to have your one big idea that you're super proud of, you're gonna have a better one in the future. Trust
Yeah.
yourself to do that, even if it can be. Even if you're like, nope, this is my one idea, I will never have another one. You will. And the best part about tabletop game is you don't have to do it alone. you'll be doing it with others. So throw it out early and then leave room for new ideas to grow.
Yeah. I think the second big thing is it's also a side effect of how I create characters, which we will probably get to later. But um, that's also
Yeah.
probably why I do it very automatically because I don't have anything else to play off of. I have the one big idea. Got to use it now.
Yeah. So I think to like kind of address the core idea of the panel, basically like for me, I usually don't create, or I don't usually create a lot about my character unless the system specifically asks certain stuff. And usually, when it asks that stuff in character creation, I am creating it on the spot. I'm not a super backstory heavy character beyond the details that I find necessary to where they are in that moment. I don't usually, I'm not a person who likes creating super fleshed out worlds for most of my characters. Some of the characters I've thought about way too much. I have one character actually that I really like because I've done that. Uh, and with that character, I literally dropped every single element that I thought of for that backstory in the first 15 minutes talking about them. Um, Other characters, I come in with like two lines and I will reveal those two lines 30 seconds into the session because that's all I got.
Yeah. Um, Yeah, usually for me, I spend a lot of time thinking about like how to make the character, but the actual thing that gets written tends to be really small. I'll think a lot about sort of either themes or conflicts I want to explore with the character and then use that as like a leverage point to be like, here's what they look like based on this. Here's their a an interesting conflict or idea with them and their name and kind of wrap that all together. But ultimately, like that description will only written out would be about a paragraph probably.
Yeah. I think there's a cool point there. Like, I think in general, there are two big purposes to backstory to me. One is falls kind of what close to what you were talking about, like coming up with all these ideas and then distilling only the few that mattered in play to help you as a person be more comfortable with the character. Like I think giving more fleshing out the character more in the back helps me sometimes be able to understand more what they would do in play, even if the specific details I thought about I don't want to appear in the game. I just want them as guide points for myself. And the second are things that I want to show up as plots and ideas and themes to explore.
Yeah, I think a lot of that too is that oh wow, I'm losing the thought too. That um really what it needs to be is that it could be long or short. It just needs to be usable for you and for everybody else. So um if you write something short, but it's not memorable enough that other people use it, or it's not communicated well enough to everybody else for them to riff off of it, it's not going to be helpful, even if it is short. And long stuff that's really memorable or that you reference often or you bring up in play is going to still be really useful because it's relevant to the game constantly.
Yeah. Um, And so I think for me, like the big part there is when you have that stuff that you want to show up in the game, there's kind of two things you can do with it, or three things I'll say that you can do with it. One is that you can just hold on to it yourself, and then hope that you find the right moment to reveal it. The second is you talk about it with either the GM or players out of character. You can be like, hey, these are things that I find really interesting about my character or backstory bits that I want to explore. And the third is just reveal them in character as soon as possible. Uh, Literally, for example, like the first conversation you have, just go, "My name is Inigo Montoya. I'm looking for the four-fingered man who killed my father."
But yeah, but like when you have that, that's already just like your character just automatically becomes 10 times more interesting.
Yeah,
Um, every, you hear that one line from Inigo Montoya, you're like, A, you know who he is. Like you know his deal, and you're already invested in this character.
yeah,
Whereas if
uh,
you held that back and you're just like, I'm looking for a man or I'm looking for someone, that's less interesting than it's, oh, I'm looking for the man who killed my father. And you're like, ah, okay, okay.
yeah. Uh, but I think like one of the advantages of this being a tabletop game is you can do both at the same time if you want. Like I
Mhm.
think both are I think this the core to being open about your tragic backstory is being open to the other players, not necessarily to the other characters. So, for example, you could go up, "I'm looking for someone who hurt me," and then you could go to other players. This is the person who killed my father. I want that to come up and be a big moment later on. I just don't want to talk about it in character now. And then other people know to like dig into the clues and build up that big reveal. Uh, and then it's a cool narrative moment for you know the story that you're building together, but you can work towards it together.
Yeah, dramatic irony is one of the best tools you have as as both a player and a GM.
Yeah.
Um, especially uh, to like use the Inigo Montoya example. If you're looking for someone, how you play into it, you like even when you don't have the details out in the open yet, matters a big difference when you communicate to the player, "Oh, I'm looking for my best friend that like I love and care for, or I'm looking for the person I want revenge against." And
Y-
those things you play into in a lot very different ways, and it has very different types of tones you need to approach.
Yeah.
Uh,
One example from like a game I was in, so like secret identities are a trope in a lot of superhero fiction. This is not a superhero game, but there was a game I was playing where one of the characters was playing three different characters sharing one identity. We in character did not know that. But we as players knew that they had three different people who would like swap out between arcs.
so like the
Uh,
Catwoman kind of thing.
I'm not sure what you're talking about.
Like where the one of the arcs of I think it's Catwoman. I hope I'm not mixing it up. In like the Batman villain, there's especially in the animators, I think they took this tack where it's three or I think three different people, and they use that as an alibi to
Yeah.
make sure none of them get caught doing crimes.
Kind of like that, but it was usually like two of them would be off screen doing stuff, and then one of them would be on playing with the characters. And while they were there, they each had subtly different personalities, but they all shared the same persona. And so it created some fun fiction where, like, we as characters knew, okay, this was the flirty one, and they were trying to start shit. But we as the characters thought it was the same person that we like liked and trusted, and would get dragged into the shit on purpose because we trusted them. And that
Mm,
caused some really cool stories.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think like the biggest advantage here is that uh, throwing out the stuff to the other players early means that you can build off of it. And I kind of want to like shift into ways you can play off of that by talking about the Spider-Man PS4 game for a second. Um, so Spider-Man PS4 does something really, really cool because at this point, almost everyone knows the Spider-Man stories. They've been reproduced and retold so many times that we're all aware of them in pop culture if you at all care about the superheroes. Even if you don't, it's hard to avoid talk of them in general. For example, most people know that Dr. Octopus is a villain. Um, and so Spider Man PS4 does a really cool thing where it opens up with you being best friends with a Dr. Octavius, who is your mentor and parental figure, and builds up your relationship with them when you know what's going to happen, because you as the audience aren't meant to not know that there's going to be a shift at some point. You watch him build prosthetic octopus limbs, like you know what's going to happen, but Peter Parker doesn't. And it's a really cool thing where you as a player are forced to sit there and like experience the narrative that's going to happen and know what is about to be shifted and what the character's about to experience, but but Peter Parker as a character doesn't know that, and so he plays into it perfectly. And that's a thing you can do at the table, in my opinion.
I have a funny story about this specific
Ooh,
thing actually.
okay.
Specifically about I haven't played the Spider-Man PS4 game, but there's actually a fun story about that exact spoiler is that when journalists were given the game to review, they were explicitly told by I think yeah by Sony, I assume, that they weren't allowed to talk about um, uh, Otto Octavius being Doc Ock. They're
Hmm,
just not allowed to mention it, which everyone like working on it was like, this is kind of silly because this is just a known fact about Spider-Man and also impacts your ability to review the game. But um
yeah,
I guess like the broader point is like being able to talk about this stuff openly actually helps facilitate storytelling a lot.
yeah,
Whereas not being able to talk about it uh, limits avenues of expression. Sometimes mysteries are good, but especially like something like a Doc Ock situation, um, you knowing and not being able to talk about it is very frustrating and not usually fun.
yeah. And also, like in my experience, at least, a lot of the more frustrating experience in role playing I've had is when secrets led to miscommunication. Right, where
Mm,
like someone intends certain elements of their backstory to be certain things or to be handled and revealed in certain ways, and me not having the knowledge of how to interact with it interacts in a way that fucks up their plans. Because I interact based on the information they've given me and not the whole story. Whereas if I knew what they were going for, I could have shifted my actions to play into that.
yeah. Yeah, it just helps you be better support when you know what you're supporting. Who knew?
Yeah.
Um, yeah, let's how about let's like go wrap around to characters again. And I think let's like dig into like how do you make a character that's suited to this kind of thing?
Yeah.
Because I think
Uh,
we've like hinted at it, but we should probably expand on it
why
before we
don't
get
you
too far into
start
this.
then? Since you're shifting the topic,
Sure. Oh no.
put
Anyway,
you on the
actually,
spotlight there.
it's not really like that difficult in a certain sense, right? Is that there's really just only a tiny amount you actually need for this kind of style, which is nice. So you can come up with it really quickly. Is just um, usually the only things you need are like one is being aware of what everybody else is making. So you want to have like some sort of interesting connection to at least one other player, preferably to everybody.
Yeah.
Um, it usually and one or two external connections. And
Mm,
within one of those connections, you just have to have like a problem your character is dealing with and a goal that they have to like deal with it. So um usually it's something pretty basic of, oh, I'm trying to, oh, let's just use an actual example that I have. I am a superhero from the future and I am here to avert this disaster. And this is the childhood of my parents. So I'm going to have interesting, weird interactions with everybody that I knew as an adult now as a teenager.
mm,
And you can just and even if you don't spell out all of those, what those relationships are necessarily, just that you know that you, in some way you know these characters, and then you
mhm.
can build that later and say, "Oh, you're my mother." Uh, and then like reveal those things either organically because you had no idea this was coming, or um, you can like just drop them at appropriate moments. Like the first 30 seconds you arrive, I'm like, I want a scene with this character, and then you tell them.
Yeah. So this is really good wisdom and like mirrors a lot of conventional advice you'll hear about creating characters that is conventional for a reason because it's really strong and structured. You should listen to Morgan and not listen to what I was saying because I don't do that. I build my characters really differently, which is actually I think good for a panel discussion.
Yeah, it's really
But
good for panel.
it means that we have different perspectives. But the way I build my characters is I will give myself like a few core facts to structure who the center of their identity is. Sometimes that's a media touchstone. Sometimes that's a personality trait. Most of my characters end up getting bound by like my sort of core themes of like found family and bonding to the and like being protective of the people you care about. And so that's how even like play antagonistic characters, they will always never be antagonistic to a group because they have that bond. But like I give them that core element that defines them to me. And then I don't do any of the relationship stuff truly until play. What I like the way I tend to play my characters is once I have the couple details out, I bond them to one other character. Like I choose one other person in the group to create a strong dynamic with, and then evolve all the other dynamics from there. So some of the things that people might recognize in Musafir's, I play at Huri, and the character I did that with was Attila, who was the other person who was a bard. I was a rogue who also did like performance stuff. And so I started by creating like, we had a strong scene in the first session, and I was like, okay, this is a cool dynamic. Let me extrapolate what the other dynamics look like from this one character dynamic. Um, yeah,
Was muted. Whoops.
yeah.
Um,
I
so
was waiting for you to
I
fix that.
yeah, I was like, wait a second. Yeah, I mean, so two things. One, I also don't always do what I what I recommend doing. Because actually, what I personally do, or at least when I'm really getting invested into a character, like spending a lot of time ahead of time thinking about what to do for a character, I'll usually like pick a theme. Like, so for you, you're like, oh, fan family, that's like a good example of one. And I will just build a whole character around that idea. Um, and so say the like character from the future is just like, oh, I just want a character that um like is dealing with a lot of like sad. I mean, basically the reason they're from the future is because I was playing masks and was playing a harbinger playbook. But the idea behind the character was, oh, I want someone who just knows everybody in the situation, but from a very but more like what they will become, right? And that already just creates
Real
an
quick,
interesting
I'm going to
dynamic.
interject with context in case some people in our audience are not familiar. Masks is
That's
a
good.
powered by the apocalypse superhero, a teen superhero role playing game for like stories like Teen Titans, or Young Avengers and stuff. And Harbinger is explicitly Cable from Deadpool, aka someone who is from a
Mhm.
future where shit went bad and they're back in time to fix it. Or Trunks from DBZ, if you're
Yeah.
like me. I
Trunks is
love
a really
one
good
swords person.
Yeah, Trunks is a really good example of it because it's basically Trunks is like, "Oh, I am I the future was bad. I know this one fact, and I just want to stop it." And when you see Trunks, he appears. He has a big fight, and then drops his one plot seed or his two plot seeds immediately upon talking to everybody, which are, "Oh, the future was bad and went horribly," and "Oh yeah, Goku, you're gonna die in a couple months," and that is Trunks' entire backstory.
That's it. Yeah. Um, so continue on what you were saying about.
Oh, yeah, and so, for me, it's, like, really about that theme because then I can just build things around it. So, my character ended up being like, "Oh, is it, like, can has a special armor that transforms into other heroes," and all of that stuff, and basically, it's just that's how I build characters, but usually to, like, make them feel more well-rounded, I like to build the relationships, but it's that part's the more practical side and less what I always do myself.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but I think it's really helpful as a standard advice because it helps party cohesion and makes everybody, like, more invested in the group.
Yeah. So actually, I want to interject on this quick point here, like, because we mentioned specifically the like masks and private apocalypse and playbooks. I want to talk a minute about how you can wield the system to create your character. Because Powered by the Apocalypse is a system as a whole that really helps with this. Powered by the Apocalypse gives you playbooks, and for those not familiar, playbooks are less mechanical what you will do and more narrative theme packages. They give you an idea of the type of story you will be playing, and they do tell you how you approach that and what you can do in that regard. But it's mostly about the type of story you'll be telling and the ways you can interact with the fiction. And in doing so, they also provide you backstory scaffolding. Meanwhile, a lot of traditional games will focus a lot more on classes that tell you what you can do, maybe even a little bit how you can do it, but won't give you that same sort of scaffolding. And so I think there's sort of different ways you can use that because I think there's a lot you can extrapolate from that nonetheless. Uh, you look like you had some things to say, so I'm gonna stop rambling
Yeah, I
so
was
you can.
only going to add also random tables can be really great. Even just in a system that doesn't have these options, just
Yeah.
grab a few random tables can be golden. Um, but
Um,
yeah,
so anyway,
you keep going for your
uh,
thought.
yeah, so like I think using the system to help give you the starting point for your character is super good. Like Powered by the Apocalypse playbooks, for example, are really great because they will give you backstory questions and also they will give you ideas for the types of stories you want to be telling and you'll know the type of characters that fit into that archetype or that challenge the archetype and be able to do cool things there. Random tables are really fun in other games or even like you can steal them for games that don't have them because they do two things. One, they give you ideas. Two, you know that whole thing where like if you're trying to make a decision, flip a coin, and if you're not happy with the result, you know what you wanted anyways. Random tables do that too. If you roll on a random table and you go, I don't want that, that sounds boring, you now know what you want or have a closer idea of what you want. And so like random tables can help kick you in like a direction. Um, but I also think in systems that don't have that, like if you're making a generic like character for trying to like I don't want to use D&D as an example. What's the
Like Genesis maybe.
yeah, sure. So you're making like a Genesis character, which is like a or a Fate character, which is
Oh
more
yeah, that's
generic.
great.
You have stat blocks, right? You have like a bunch of skills. You have stunts. Fate even gives you a high concept, and that's about it. You look at all that, and you might want to go, okay, what does that tell me about my character? And that still gives you a lot of information. What? Why is my character a like? Why does my character have this specific set of skills? What might lead them to have had that? Is that something that they picked up in personal interest? Is that something that they picked up because of their background, because of their family? You can get extrapolate from the pieces on your sheet if you're unsure where to start from.
Yeah, and I think that like is a really good thing. And also, even I think Core does this, right? Where you have aspects that are your relationships with other people too, that are also good for this kind of
Hmm.
thing. But also just but speak like system mechanics aside, like things that are just generally helpful is just figuring out like ways to anchor yourself to other characters and to the main thrust of like the premise that you're in. So not necessarily like, oh, I have to be the chosen one connected to this plot. I mean, you just have to have like a hook in the world that like gives you a reason to be with the group and engage with like whatever the main premise is and like a problem you have that relates to like something in the world. So like, oh, if you're just in like this, like if you're dropped into a fantasy world that's like you're in the backdrop of like two countries like at war with each other or like about to be at war. It doesn't you don't necessarily have to be engaged with that plot, but if you have something that like emerges naturally from that, like, oh, I have conflict with this other party member because we're from different countries in this conflict. And that
Yeah,
already becomes interesting.
yeah. And there's also more generic ways you can go with it that like beyond the specific systems or what's available to you. Sleepy in the chat, who I think is John, mentioned that you can use exercises like listing a bunch of truths or lies about your characters. You can also draw on things that are personal, like if you once you play a couple times, you start to get a feel for what kinds of characters you play. Like I can pretty much nail my archetype in a few sentences. I can nail a lot of the folks I've played with frequently's archetype in a few sentences. Like half of the chat whom I know, I can list their character archetypes pretty easily from having played a few sessions with them. Um, and so knowing that can give you either a starting off point. Sometimes it can just be comfortable to play close to your archetype or borrow an aspect from them. The other is it can give you an excuse to challenge it or to explore different stories once you have an idea for what you do.
Yeah. And a lot of like when you're like when I like talk about approach picking themes, it's mostly just like finding like a type of story I'm interested in. Because a lot of time it'll just be, oh, I've watched this thing recently. I love this aspect of the story. How about I like take this core idea and it could just be let's take something that I haven't made a character for. Spies, and like you having an identity that you've lied about your whole life and you now have to pretend that it's real. And like you can like throw that into a character and
Yeah.
just because like you like already have a strong reaction to a thing, you're just excited about it. And
Yeah.
also that that secret is great for your tragic backstories. And the show that I'm drawing it from reveals that episode too.
Yeah. Uh, I also like to piggyback off of that. I think drawing on media and things that you're passionate about is a great way to do it. Like I will often a lot of my characters will be reactions to media I recently consumed and me looking at it and like, oh, this was almost good. Or this is great. It
Hmm.
just needed something to be fixed. I'll be like, well, I can fix that. I can
Exactly.
I can do whatever I want with that.
What
Uh
if what if it was the way I wanted it to be? And you
yeah,
can.
exactly. Uh No, that's pretty much like a lot of tabletop stuff can be self-indulgent and fulfilling stuff that you want to do. Don't be afraid to lean into that as jumping off points for your characters. The other thing I will give Bo an equal hand is I think backstory can very easily be used as a way to restrict yourself. And one of the advantages of like being super open about it off the bat is it means you don't have pieces that are unknown that you feel beholden to. Everything is out there, and you can start to develop new bits as you go forward. Uh, like, you look like you can see me, or
No, you finish your thought. I will
yeah,
piggyback off it though.
yeah. I guess I was saying like that in general, if you have all these secrets that you're holding inside yourselves, you feel like you're obligated to be loyal to them, and it might restrict you from discovering what the character could be, and forces you to stick to what the character was in your mind. And that could be what you want to do. Like if you want to just keep the character on one note, super cool. But I think like most narratives generally show character growth or development, especially in response to the environment or their teammates or coworkers or what have you, and being able to put all that out there so you can discover who they become is an important part of play.
Yeah. And sometimes like so picking back off that, one thing that sometimes I will build into characters is just like not necessarily a planned story arc so much as um here is something that they're having trouble with right now and a way I could imagine them improving. And that might not be what happens, but at least it gives you like a direction for role play just to be like to play into, and you'll just start to veer off course. And then the second thing related to backstory is that um the best way to put it is like you can think of like everything that you've like written down before you start playing as like this whole like free cloud of ideas that are all just hanging out. And because you've written them down, there's like the impulse to like not necessarily always talk about them or just think they're already true. But really, it's unless you start integrating them into the game and how you and like the game you're playing right now, they're not yet real. They're not real until you like talk about them and like put them into the game. So
Yeah.
start using them. And um, if you're like me, you have only one idea, that means that your idea starts getting dropped right away. But if you have a long backstory and you have 20, 30 ideas, just make sure you're just constantly feeding them in and just building a character that way.
Hmm. Yeah. Um, Also, to quickly jump off of something that was mentioned in the chat by Adam, it's that uh yeah, like, so one of the things that you can do is, if you want to, you can not give your character an arc. And also, once your character has an arc, you can choose either to work towards giving them a new arc, or one thing I did in the game that was like a longer term campaign, my character had one or two big arcs, and their character reached a point where like they'd reached the end of their character, but they still had a role in the narrative of the others. So as I was playing them from that point forward, their goal was to be the side character to the other characters in the story, because they'd done their growth and their plot. And that's perfectly acceptable thing to do as well. Like, you can play, even if you still have your own arc, you can still play as a side character for a couple arcs and like support the other people and not have much growth or personal character moments yourself.
Yeah. I mean, being invested in other people is great. And also, you can help showcase them by just like by just being like a contrast, even if you're not necessarily having a lot of change in your character, you just being like, I'm the one that like had my arc and I'm friendly now, can help, you can just already be like a good foil to the loner character that's trying to learn that in the next arc. um but
Yeah.
so you can just be a support and still tell great stories that way.
Yeah. So I think one of the things I want to talk about though is, before we continue talking about ways you can like bring these stories about, is what are some examples of like times that you've done this that have stood out to you in the moments they've created? Like a certain conversation with yourself.
We really
You
get
know you're gonna
okay.
talk about this at
I
some
mean,
point,
I was
right?
actually going to reference the one I've been referencing all this panel, but sure, we can do this one too.
You do the other one first, and then we can do that one.
Okay. So both of these are mass examples, but so let's talk about the person from the future real quick.
Yeah.
Um so their tragic backstory, very much like Trunks, is um there was they like how do I put it quickly? Basically, the short answer is they were sent to the present by their mom, who like built the time travel machine, because a supernatural force busted a hole from basically like a Feywild situation, busted into the real world, and big fight happened, and everything got destroyed. Um, and so literally and I didn't actually have that much backstory written out. I didn't have any established relationships between any of the characters, or um just that one of my characters was similar to another because we were both using the same kind of media inspirations for creating our characters. And so it just started off like session like scene one. I would just like, let me frame a scene with this person. And as it just boiled down, like a couple scenes later, it's like, oh, why are you similar to me? And I'm like, oh, this is my tragic backstory. And then a
Mhm.
couple scenes later, it's like, wait, but seriously, what is your deal? I'm like, I'm actually from the future. And then we engage some game mechanics, and it's, oh, you're actually my mom.
Ooh.
And that was the end of session one, was that last scene.
Hmm.
Where that reveal happens. And you're like, "Oh, where do you go from here?" And, well, I do have a long story for this, but we should probably come back to that.
Yeah.
And you can tell your example of this first.
Right. Well, I also want to like add that, like, I think the moment you do that, right, you can spend, like, you could have spent an entire like 2 to 7, 8, 9 sessions dancing around that reality, right? Um, you could have kept like avoiding admitting it and had some fun scenes with that. But once you put it out there, you can now explore the implications of it being in the world. You could go, as the chat is saying, you can only go up.
Yeah, and I mean, as what happens, with that character in the future is just more future stuff gets being revealed of, it's not just that you're my mom, but and you can expand on that relationship, or, "Oh, what about this other character that we both know that's also in the future?" And then these more and more things keep, like, snowballing.
Yeah.
My Do you wanna tell your story, or do you want me to tell the other
I'm
story?
trying to think of, like, the problem is I haven't played as like player in a campaign in a while. Um,
Do
like
you want me to
there's a
buy
time
you time?
yeah, go ahead and buy me time while I think.
Okay, so second story, which is the story that actually inspired this panel, is we were Amr and I were playing in a game where I was playing basically the child of a supervillain, and in back like basically our session zero, we just established that uh, my character's parent was was a supervillain who was well intentioned but was going about it in a way that was very bad, and in doing so. Teleported Amr's character to another dimension and alienated them from their family for several years. But I
I
know,
did have a
my
tragic backstory
character,
there.
yeah, yeah, and my character knows this, but their character doesn't know that I am, or specifically knows that my character is connected to that villain, but I doesn't know that I am their child, and also there's a secret identity component where they know my mundane identity and doesn't know that they have any superhero connections whatsoever. And so the end of session one of that game was my character in civilian form revealing, um, so yeah, you know how I'm an orphan? Well, I'm not actually an orphan. I'm just the child of X, which actually also yet again was the very end of that session, wasn't
Yeah.
it?
Uh, and so like that was great because the moment that happened, I now knew, like I had known from the start out of character. And so I built
Mhm.
up a scene that allowed that to happen. And we were like, do we want it to happen in this scene? And Morgan decided that they wanted that to happen in that scene.
I can't
Uh
help myself.
yeah. And the moment it was out there, where could we go from there? We had the ability to explore the implications of me knowing that. And me still not knowing that two of the people that they were playing are the same person. Um
Yeah. I mean, and also, so the first thing is that just because you lay out your cards on the table doesn't mean that the situation's resolved.
yeah,
Because immediately after me dropping the backstory bomb, my character panics and runs away, which means there's still no resolution. The facts are, it's the peak dramatic situation of the facts are all known, but no one's talked about it yet.
yeah,
And that can still be the slow burn. That's a really good slow burn because
yeah,
now everything's out there, but also what do we do? And that becomes the
yeah.
question you play on.
Yep. Uh, and from there, like we were able to create stuff. Like after a minute, I'm like, you know what? I think my character has a crush on your character, and that
Yeah.
added more tension. Like in character, they weren't aware of that. My character didn't know they had a crush because they're oblivious, and also have weird relations to their own sexuality. And the other character also just hadn't noticed. So we had moments of like
Also,
them.
it didn't help that the GM was like, "Here's third character that has crush on my character," to like make that situation more complicated.
Yeah. So and it was great because out of character, we now all had these pieces. We knew about this, like how our backstories connected. We knew about how our characters felt and interacted with one another. But in character, they only had pieces of the information, and we could
Hmm.
build up that dramatic tension around that.
Yeah, and then also the third player can was constantly lampshading this fact,
Yeah.
uh, and basically being like, just saying like, and is just being the character who can see it, but like just can't tries to break it as like gently as possible to the other two, but they still don't get it, and it's great.
Yeah. Um. But I lost what I was gonna say.
Yeah, you still have an example to give.
Uh. Okay. So I'm trying to think because like the thing is I haven't played a character in a long time, so that's one example of a character. Um, I have recent well, yeah, you know what, I will talk about future boxer briefs. uh so future boxer briefs was from a Dragon Ball Z fan game me and a bunch of my friends played, and in it we all played self inserts of the characters. So we had, we had a Mond who was a Videl insert. uh I play a lot of long games. I mostly just run them. We had Future Box Briefs, who was my Trunks insert, but who had like elements of his granddad Vegeta. And then there was a Saiyan insert. Uh, and like Future Boxer Briefs is like a name that tells you everything you need to know about the character if you know anything about Dragon Ball Z. Because if you know anything about Dragon Ball Z, you know that the entire Briefs family has a naming scheme that kind of ties them together. Uh, Trunks, uh, Bulma, Panchi, etc. They all that is their naming scheme. And the future implies that he's from the future, much like his own father, here to avert a catastrophe. And so the players all knew that off the bat, and various amounts of information were revealed in character and caused some fun moments. With getting able to like interact with our own genre knowledge of the character and their backstory, and being able to play that with the genre awareness while in character. Usually no one knows anything about the time travel shit except the time traveler. And so that's what we were able to play around and create some fun moments where the implications that were revealed in using the time travel could be explored. Yeah.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, let's dig into this a little bit. So,
Yeah. Uh,
um, for yours, for your character,
yeah.
so, how long did it take for you to tell everyone you're from the future, or is it like something you did really quickly?
Um, so out of character, everyone knew off the bat. Like that
Yeah,
was
I
the
mean
character
in
bit.
character.
In character. Um, in character, I think it came up pretty quickly. And it caused some fun tension with another character, who got all like, "You can't time travel. That breaks the order of space time." And I'm like, I'm here now. You can't stop me." And they're like, "Fine, we're gonna deal with this once we deal with our immediate problem." And that just kept getting kicked down the line and causing some like fun inter-character relations, by them knowing and being grumpy about it, but our character knowing that it was fine.
Nice, excellent.
Yeah. Uh,
Um, do you have something?
no,
I was gonna
what
change
do you say?
topics. So,
Oh yeah.
I think
Uh,
related to this,
yeah.
now we have to get the how I would describe it is instead of the opposite of slow burn play style, the always burning play style.
Okay.
um, but basically, like all it is just like two things. One, reveal stuff early and just like keep those implications rolling and
Yeah.
snowballing. But the other thing is just um even like once you light the big fire, you just keep stoking it. Just keep
Yeah.
throwing stuff on it, letting it burn, and then the second most important thing, letting it spiral into other stuff.
Yep.
And then once it starts lighting secondary stuff, it's just drama, uh, fireworks, I guess. Yeah, let's just keep going with this poor metaphor.
Oh yeah. Um,
um,
So I think one thing we got to talk about here is get into the game design term. We just talk about some like terminology. Terms that get thrown around a lot are like in regards to improv style play is something called emergent gameplay or emergent storytelling, and what that really means is just play to find out what happens, discovering your characters, discovering the plot, discovering w- how even what you want out of the game as it happens, right? And that is a style of play that I think like usually they're proposed as like you either have a style of gameplay where you know what's going to happen and you've prepared and you've got this backstory written out ahead of time, or you play to find out what happens. And a lot of times those are pushed as being in opposition. I don't think so at all. I don't.
no.
But and I think like one way you like well one of the reasons that can happen is if you're holding on to all this stuff that you've got pre-prepared and haven't revealed that, you get into that situation where you can't create new stuff because you're still trying to sort out the old stuff. Whereas if you put it out there, you can deal with the old stuff by coming out discovering new stuff and new aspects of the character in the fiction. You look like you had
Yeah,
some stuff to say.
yeah, and I think like also it really um how this like making a character that fits this kind of situation well is like also how you structure your backstory, right?
Yeah,
Because or not just your backstory, but just how you've created this character and its conception. Because if you just plan like a lot out ahead of time, where you're like, oh, I have my character is has wants revenge, is going to find out about the revenge when we meet this villain, is like this is the person I want revenge on, and then it becomes an arc of and then I have to get revenge on them, and like having that whole arc like planned in your head can also like inhibit sometimes it's good having a plan, and like as long as you're flexible enough about diverging, then it's
yeah,
not really a problem. But
yeah,
sometimes it can also, if you've written it a certain way, can make it harder, not impossible, just
yeah.
harder to like adapt.
Yeah, I think like one of the great ways to write your backstory for this kind of play is to put in some holes in places that can be filled in time. One of my favorite things to do during a game is to see a scene that's happening and in that moment make a big character backstory decision just for the most dramatic outcome of that scene. And usually I will check with the other characters before doing it, especially if it's going to be a tonal shift. But like I love introducing new details about my character that I didn't even know up until that moment because it pushes that fire and keeps things burning forever. Um, there's one example of this that I talked about on the last panel that I will not talk about again to spare the feelings of people in the audience on in the Pokemon campaign that I played. So you can hear about that on the other panel that we plugged at the start. Uh, there's going to be a more recent example coming out on a podcast that you will know about when it's out.
Ooh.
Yeah, I'll just vague hint, but like I did that recently where their moment came up for a character I was playing who had a similar background to like has some big tragedy in their past, and we talked about the tragedy and what the tragedy is, but we hadn't defined specifics of how the tragedy had affected them. And in that moment I saw a really cool opportunity to find one specific way that it had personally affected the character and reveal that through the fiction in a powerful way. And so I made that decision that and created a whole new character for their backstory that I had not come up with up until that moment.
Yeah, and I think a second tip, about, like, emergent stuff is just, um, like, when things come up that you didn't know about before, like, just say that you know them. Like, no people, no places, no things, and, like, the fact that you're, like, you know about it is interesting because it already raises questions of, like, "How do you know this person?" And then it, like, implies things about your backstory, or, "Why do you know about this secret order of space knights that no one everyone thought was dead?" Unless and then that raises questions of, "Oh, are you a secret Jedi?"
Mm,
Just automatically. Um,
yeah,
and just like being connected to the world, even if it's just something you're like, oh, I'm interested in this facet. Obviously, ask permission
yeah,
first because that's important.
yeah.
But knowing things and like being like intimately connected to things can just be really interesting, even if you don't yet know why.
Yeah. And actually, real quick, I want to talk about safety tools and backstory for a moment.
Hmm.
I've talked about safety tools a lot before, and I can again, and will gladly again. But the specific aspect I want to talk about them with regards to backstory is that backstory is an area where you can sometimes fall into traps of not knowing the boundaries of your people. Like when you're creating something at the table, there are other folks around you who will be able to interact with what you're saying and modify it if something crosses the line. When you write backstory, especially if you write backstory on your own, you can sometimes inadvertently go into that territory. Yeah, a great resource for looking at safety tools, one of which I'm going to mention now, is the TTRPG Safety Toolkit by Kiana Shaw and Lauren Brian Monk, which just won an Emmy tonight. So congratulations to them.
Congratulations.
Um, yeah, best free RPG product, I believe, was the Emmy category, but that happened literally like 20 minutes before we got on. Um, but one of the tools there is lines and veils. Lines and veils is a tool in which you get a list of hard no's and things that can happen that we won't get into details of or that will fade to black on or whatnot. Having that list before you make your backstory can be really helpful because then you know stuff not to include. Like some of it can be big narrative bits that will be like it can be a little rough. Like as a player, if you draft this whole thing and the core central idea is something that other players don't want to interact with, that is a lot of work and time that you put in stuff that shouldn't be part of that game. If you have the tool set up in the first place, you can avoid that. And some of it can be really minor stuff, like someone might not be comfortable with spiders, right? And they might not want spiders in the game, so you change a small bit of your backstory from spiders to ants or something equivalent. Uh, and you make modifications based on the other players so that whatever you bring to the table is safe and creates a comfortable experience for everyone without you putting in a lot of work that you will not be able to use because you've infringed on someone else's boundary.
Yeah. Which is and this is, like, part of why being open with things is at least being open to the players, if not to the characters, is really important.
Yeah.
Um, yeah,
But
but,
yeah.
like, a lot of this, like, especially when you're, like, creating a tragic backstory, which is the subject of this panel, safety tools can be really important to like keep in
Yeah.
mind because then you start like skating on stuff that can either be things that people don't want in their game or things that really just remind people of personal things that have happened in their life they might not
Yeah.
have declared ahead of time just because they didn't think it was going to come up and they just didn't
Yeah.
realize they'd mentioned it, and just communicating ahead of time will just be can save a lot of like headaches and future grievances
Yeah.
and just like problems because you don't want to hurt your friends, right? And this is
Yeah.
just one way of like taking care of everybody.
Yeah, and that real quick, I want to segue to the fact that like this panel is generally about tragic backstory, but the secret here is that like not most of these things apply to non-tragic backstories too. Like for example, if you have an element of your backstory that one or both of your parents are like a super recognizable name in the setting, you know, and you have some
Mhm.
sort of celebrity or whatnot, and it's not a tragic thing, it's just like a thing you are not revealing. That's a pretty common trope in a lot of fiction. having other players know about it means you can create some really cool situations where they start like talking about your family or your parents or whatnot around you, and you can create some like fun drama where they're like, "Oh yeah, did you see what like this famous celebrity did on TV?" And you're like, "Ah ha ha, yeah, that was pretty interesting. Haha, we're not talking about my parents." Um, and like that can create some like it's a non-tragic thing unless you want it to be. It can obviously any king can be tragic if you try hard enough. But like there's a lot of elements of backstory that can be non-tragic. Like you could be like, oh yeah, I own a restaurant, you know, or I worked as a chef, and that might not be tragic, but the players knowing that and being able to play around that, even if the characters don't, can strengthen your story.
Yeah, and it could just be if the GM knows about it, they like send you all to a restaurant for
Yeah,
like a situation and you're like, "Yeah, this is my time to shine." Or it could just be the other players are like just want to set you up for like your character being interesting and they can help set you up like, "Oh, I'm hungry." And then you're like, I can like do something here." And like just being able to like know other people's backstories and call out to them in fun ways,
yeah.
even if it's not tragic. It's great.
Uh,
It's great
that's
when
also
people know and care about your character, because it just feels good, but also then you get a chance to, like, build off that and do something cool.
yeah. To kind of piggyback off that, I think one of the strongest tools you have available to you when like once you've revealed your character backstory and to figure out how to build the drama and the narrative from there is the other players, including your facilitator or game master or what have you. And I don't mean just in the sense of like piggybacking off of them at the table and like bouncing off of one another. Um, you also have the ability to talk with them in between sessions. One of the things I love doing as a player is going to other players in between sessions and be like, hey, I think our characters have this really cool point of connection. We have this thing that binds them together in some way. I would like to build a few scenes exploring that so that we can end up with a really cool climax to that arc. And that's a thing that could have potentially happened naturally. It could have just kept hoping that it would have happened. And sometimes it will, and sometimes it won't, and you'll get frustrated waiting for it to happen. But if you work with the others when they know your backstory, you can build off of those details for one another.
Yeah, and, um and just, like, calling out stuff can also help, like, maybe the person wasn't even thinking about it, and just you suggesting the idea, they get really excited and they're like, "Yeah, I wanna do this." And,
Yeah.
can be just a way to, like just, like, spark inspiration in other people too. Um I wanna, like, take it slightly different direction. Let's,
Uh,
like, do some examples here,
oh, okay.
because
Real
like,
quick,
oh, you got
I'm gonna say just like as a thing, the panel, we will probably be doing like a more formal Q&A towards whenever we come to our end. But if at any point you all have questions you want to ask, throw them in the chat. And if we don't answer them immediately, we'll throw them in the doc for the end section. Just wanted to let you all know you can do that. Continue.
yeah, but I think, um, just to, like, help people, like, envision what we mean by, like oh, help people envision what they mean for,
Mhm.
situations, like, it's just like, let's do, like, some concrete, like, examples from, like, our own games
Okay.
like, show, like, this is how we do it, and this is how we, and, like, here's, like, an example, so we have, like, a story rooted in the mind,
Yeah.
right? And while I mute myself, while I fix this microphone.
Okay. Sounds good. So I think like one example I've had of that recently is actually the Pokemon podcast that I'd mentioned. We were doing characters where two of our characters were from the same town and had a one character who was a staple of that town who was a central figure influencing both of our backstories in two wildly different ways. I looked at the figure as someone who motivated me to become who I want in opposition to the figure, whereas to the other, the figure was literally a father figure. Um, and in character, we did not know that about each other. Out of character, we did. And so I talked to the other person like in between sessions. I was like, hey, I think it would be really cool for us to explore and have scenes where our characters start to discover the different ways we view this person before it becomes revealed the full extent of the connection. And so we started like setting up small scenes where like I would talk about or through action reveal how that character inspired me and they would do the same. And then we could sort of like our character started to react to how the other character viewed the same central figure, despite them not recognizing it fully.
Nice. Um, yeah, for me, let me think of a good example. I guess we'll just take this future character again because
Sure.
they just have connections with everybody. So it was, um, I think there was like one time where I like went to one of the other players and just said, uh, Look, I think there's like this interesting like dynamic between these two. Um, and it's just that I think my character like wants to look to yours for wisdom, not because our situations are similar, because I'm from the future and that's weird, but like it's the next closest thing of like how do I relate to like predecessors and legacy and things like that, and your
Yeah.
character is like from a long line of speedsters. Like I think there's like something interesting to do here. Are you interested in exploring this too? And then that became like a thing that like we like talked about, and then we're able to like role play later on, uh because I'd brought it up, and I just thought was like interesting and a thing to go, and also wouldn't have happened probably like neatly organically, just
Hmm.
because it's not like a natural like connection that those two probably would have shared otherwise. But because I like we like made sure to call it out and like play into it, got some good stuff in.
Yeah, and that's and there's also like examples of times where I've done that with the GM, where like I want to set up a big moment, and I've talked with the GM about like, hey, can we get set up a scene where this comes out to your players? Also, real quick, I want to address something that's brought up in the chat as a like as a kind of capping on the safety tools point I put earlier.
Mhm.
Sleepy pointed out that like he's had the inverse experience where someone put an element in their backstory that would normally be a line, and he didn't feel comfortable speaking up about it because they didn't want to take something away from the character. And that can be a really tough situation to be in as someone where like this is a thing that is making you uncomfortable and crossing a boundary, but because someone has already become attached to it, it's hard to then explicitly state the boundary. And that's why part of like making backstory and safety tools, setting those up early as possible, getting it so that backstory can be done in group play a lot of the time can be really useful in order to avoid those types of situations.
Yeah, it's really tough to have those kind of conversations, but also things like is it the Monte Cook Games
Hmm.
one
Hmm.
allowing you to like send things about lines and veils anonymously can also help sometimes. If you're not comfortable saying it and like creating some sort of conflict, like being able to anonymously suggest lines and veils can help just make it like less burdensome on you. But also sometimes just doing it safety tools first and then backstory later can also be
Yeah.
ways to keep around it. But it's hard. There's no easy way. But
Uh, yeah. Actually, I want to first like maybe pivot a bit to like the starting topic of like how do you create backstory and talk maybe a bit about like creating backstory on your own versus creating backstory in a group setting.
mm,
Um, so, like, I think a lot of games that I play tend to lean towards the latter, creating backstory in a group setting. Specifically because I do a lot of Powered by the Apocalypse games, and those usually have a relationship section, and usually have a pretty simple backstory section where you answer 3 or 4 questions, which everyone can do in the span of like sitting down and going around the table. And so it encourages doing that as a group and getting live feedback and being able to play off the other people to be cohesive.
yeah, I have trouble creating characters by myself, specifically for this reason of um for me, like my characters don't start to click and like really make sense to me until I can start rooting them in concrete things, specifically relationships with other characters and like their relationship to the world or like maybe society more specifically. Because without that context, I like don't know what like forces are pulling and pushing on them,
Yeah,
and those are the things that are like for me like those conflicts and dynamics are the things that tend to be most interesting. So it's really hard unless I'm actually like
yeah,
really familiar with what we're doing. So it could
hmm,
be, oh, I like know the media property, and then you can like then it's a little easier.
yeah,
But otherwise, like have creating in a group just gives me more raw material to like
yeah.
craft a character, and they don't really, even if come in with ideas, like most of them are just like are there's a lot of holes that I don't start filling in
Mhm.
until like stuff about the party dynamic and the world starts to become clearer, just
Yep.
because I love engaging with that stuff, so I want to create characters that do.
Yeah. Um, I think you can run into so there's some like advantages to crafting a backstory ahead of time. For one, it gives you a stronger base. Sometimes you might just not have ideas. Sometimes you might be a little uncertain. Like there's times where I'm not really sure or comfortable making character on the spot, and having backstory ideas to draw from really helps provide me a structure there. I think for me the key part there is structure because if I'm too tightly married to those ideas, it can sometimes create a tonal dissonance with the group, which is I think that can happen if you all create characters with zero communication at all. Being able to talk with one another gives you the ability to ground it at least tonally, if not directly, into the other characters. Um,
And also asking other people for suggestions about your character can
yeah,
be great. Both in two ways. One, just like asking them, like, "Oh, I don't know what would be an interesting tragedy," and some people will just come up with like better ideas than you'd have because you're too like tunnel visioned. But also, it's some you can just be, would you can just go to the rest of the party like, "Would any of you wanna be my sibling?"
yeah,
And just see if someone, like, is interested in that, and that can be fun too.
yeah. I definitely ask a version of that. It's usually like, "Hey, who else have dated in the past?" And a lot of my characters. But yeah, being able to like establish stuff like that, it can create some really fun hooks for your characters.
Mm,
Um, I'd also add that like it sometimes can reveal what might or might not be important to a character. Like a lot of times I will have characters that do have parents in theory, but I've never once written a single word or even a name for the character. And like there's definitely something to be said about like the trope of characters not having parents and like some sloppy writing there. But in general, for me, like I only include certain familial connections if I find them important to a character. So like some of my characters have really tightly defined families because those are core to their theming and their stories. And so, like, part of my prep, if at all, for a character will be defining the character's family or their familial structure or what have you. Uh, where some characters will never have their parents come up or even a last name because it's just not important to what I see as the character story.
yeah. I always like to have at least, like, a connection and to, like, a family, specifically, some sort of vertical one where,
Mm,
like, you have parents or parental figures of some sort, and, like, this can just be, oh, you have a mentor or something like that, just
yeah.
because, um having like NPCs to interact with like roots you in the world a little stronger, and that helps just like help your character fit in, or at least thinking about it, even if it doesn't necessarily come up, helps you place your character in the world, and that can be useful even if it's not something that you use and you just don't create this character, but just like thinking about what your character's relationships to the world around them and like
Mm,
the like powerful people in the world around them
yeah.
can tell you a lot about who they are.
Yeah, 100%. Also, Adam point in chat pointed out that if your family is fine, they don't come up. And that's, yeah, I think like in general, like if you have elements of your backstory that are normal or uninteresting to the development of your character, like they don't need to come up. You can just say, yeah, like I had the uninteresting family life that was unnecessary to who they are, for example, or with any other part of their backstory. And there's like, I think there's two approaches to that. Sometimes you might want to explicitly say like, yeah, they have no family, that's like I'm being explicit. I'm not defining them because they didn't have any. Or I can say explicitly, yeah, they had a family, but it's unimportant to the story. The third option is to say they may or may not. We'll figure it out if it becomes relevant. And
Yeah.
that's where you leave sort of a hole in the story to be filled in as you play along.
Yeah. And sometimes you can leave deliberate holes where, like what you were saying, and saying like, this is something that interests me, but I don't know how to execute it yet. So I'm going to leave and sometimes you can communicate this, or you just like leave it in your own notes of,
Mm,
I have parent that, and maybe they're, and you just like give like some sort of like broad class description of them, and then you can like just latch on to someone as they pop up, not
yeah,
necessarily being your parent but like knowing them, like you're like, oh, I know you, merchant, because my
yeah,
parents also a merchant, and then that becomes like a thing.
yeah.
um
Actually, like to jump off that, I think a lot of times, there are elements of character backstory that are like, sometimes you just put a list of things. And to me, like it's a lot more interesting to do stuff like what Morgan was just talking about than to like I would much rather know what my familial structure means to the fiction than I would having specific names for any of them. Like I would much
yes.
rather know, like, okay, I come from this type of family background that would give me this kind of connections or interactions or reputations, rather than like having specific names for them. And some people really might need those specific names or want those specific names. I'm just a person who doesn't name most things unless I need to refer to them directly.
Yeah, I usually name things because coming up with names on the spot is hard, but
Yeah.
purely for this reason.
Yep. It's a fair reason to have names for things.
Yeah, because they'll always be like, "Well, what's?" Because they'll always be the GM will be like, "So what's their name?" Sometimes because they don't want to come up with a name, and I'll just have to you just I'll just be like, "No names, my
Yeah,
real
what's that?
villain."
Ah,
But yeah.
yeah.
Um, let's see. I think there was something I wanted to go back to.
Okay.
I'm trying
Uh,
to think. Something. Oh, actually, but it's like it's kind of related to like leaving holes,
yeah.
right? But I think like discovering new stuff.
Okay.
So where do we like? So I think it would be interesting. So we talked a lot about like, oh, playing um to like discover things,
Yeah.
but I think we should like tie it into the backstory of like how can we use the reveal of the tragic
Yeah.
backstory to snowball into new things.
Okay.
Because I think it's like pretty closely related to discovery, and
Yeah.
it uses a lot of the same principles, but
Yeah.
has a lot of new stuff, and I think it's a good talking point.
Yeah. I mean, so like, if you in general, like, the philosophy of like playing to find out what happens is about playing to see where the narrative logically goes. And one component of the narrative is your backstory, right? And so when you're trying to guess what's going to happen next, one of the details you can draw upon are the bits of backstory that are out in the open, either as in character or out of character. Um,
Yeah, and I think also just I think would be interesting thing to talk about would be so you reveal the like what's step 2 after revealing your tragic backstory? Where do we build from here, you
yeah,
know? So like to take the example of, oh, I'm from the disastrous future and you're my mom. Where do you go from there? That kind of
yeah.
thing.
Um,
Um,
I don't know. Do you have something you want to say?
I mean, I could. I mean,
Uh,
but I if you go first.
yeah, I feel like there's a couple of ways, right? So I think like the first is it's sometimes useful to know if this is a thing that drastically changes a situation or if it's a thing that's just out in the open. Like there are some facts that when they become revealed need to be dealt with before we can move on from them. Like for example, that is going to the fact that you example mentioned of like knowing that you are my mom and I am from the future will change those two characters' relationship and need to be addressed before that relationship can move forward.
Mhm.
Whereas I can reveal to you, like my friend, that that person that I am from the future, that person is my mom, and that doesn't directly influence our relationship right away. That can be something out in the open for us to deal with later. I think like the first step is sort of identifying what is laying the groundwork for later story and what needs to be hit on right away.
Mm,
Because I think both have room, right? Like you don't need to address every bit of your tragic backstory right away. Like my name is Nigo Montoya, you killed my father, prepare to die. It doesn't happen until an hour or some change after we get that reveal. Like we know like what Inigo Montoya is after. We learn who the man is way later, and that clash and actually dealing with the ramifications of that doesn't happen towards the end of the story.
yeah. Um, yeah, I think it's there's like I think there's a lot of subparts to that, but I
Yeah,
guess we'll have to do that one at a time. I think so.
yeah,
One of the things you said is like, oh, how much do we need to address like in the like sort of immediate fallout, right? That's kind of what you're like
yeah,
going for, and I think part of it um is that you don't need to come to clean resolutions to these kind of situations, right?
yeah,
Like if you're in a movie, the clean resolution to Inigo Montoya's story is he gets his revenge, right? And because it's a movie, or if we're talking like RPG terms, like one shots, like it's fine to like yeah, just have the resolution, right? And if you're playing in a long term campaign, you can have those resolutions be messy because
yeah,
that's just fertile ground to come back. So if like so to use the I'm from the future and you're my mom example, um, like it becomes like a conflicting thing where it's not necessarily a relationship's bad, but then there's a lot of like things to unpack there, right? Like one, what was our relationship like in the future? Um, whereas like was I a good parent? And that's the thing that can like we can come back to because the answer just might be sometimes or most of the time, and then there's a lot of like things you can just mine for future ideas or um like oh what about us now, like we can't be like I can't be your parental figure because you're older than me.
mhm,
um but I feel responsible for you now, and that can be just a thing that like keeps burning in the background, right? Where it's there's not going to be a clean resolution of, oh, I have decided to put you in this box and it's over. It's, oh, we have to keep revisiting this and
yeah,
keep talking about it. And once, and even though the problem's out in the open, just it's not solved, and
yeah.
that means that it's still important and still relevant to the story and still
Yeah.
churns.
Um, to add to that, like I feel like in general, you kind of want a healthy balance of the different elements, right? Like you want some stuff that is out there that won't be addressed for a long time. Like you want some long personal character beats that will come up bit by bit, either in or out of character until it reaches a dramatic culmination. Uh, you also want some that come out right away, have are immediately dealt with, and then they just help set the tone for the characters off the bat and don't get addressed again. And you want some that are recurring, like they come up, we deal with the ramifications of it in the moment, we deal with it again, and all of those help give different pacing to the story.
Yeah, I think like yeah, and like the key to like sum that up, like hopefully I'm not taking too much of what you
No.
said, but I think it's part of it is like you have to like keep the forward momentum of the story, but specifically by saying here are some long tail things and here are some things that we can deal with right now and fix.
Yeah.
Um, and in like the Inigo Montoya story, it's maybe the resolution isn't oh I get my revenge. It's oh I learned something about the four fingered or six fingered man. I don't remember. Um,
Yeah.
it's and you like you learn like who this person is, and that becomes a concrete milestone, and you feel like you're getting somewhere, but it's
Mhm.
not solving the problem.
Yeah. And to draw an example, from so like as a not as a player but as a GM recently, like in Star Wars game I run, one of the characters is force sensitive. Didn't at the start of the play know it in character, but had it mechanically on their sheet and would talk about it with the rest of us. And so that created a really interesting dynamic in which we revisited that topic multiple times until it eventually became out in the open. But out of character, we knew he was drawing on that. We knew whenever he rolled to use the force as part of his action, and we could see how that affected the story. The other characters could start to pick up on it and start to react, and we would decide when it made the most narrative sense for them to really fully know and to fully come to terms and talk about it. And that created some fun fiction where, like, that element of them being force sensitive was recurring. Whereas another character was a shapeshifter, and it was revealed that they were a shapeshifter at the end of the first session. And that was a thing that caused like some tension and some like, oh, you've been lying to us this entire time. It was addressed. And then from that point forward, we never had to like revisit anything with that regard because the people had come to terms with it. And so those are like two examples of how those might manifest in play of like different elements from your backstory being handled to different degrees.
Yeah, exactly. And then there was another component of what you were saying in the beginning was like long tail things,
Yeah.
right? Should what were you thinking about like that when you brought it up?
Yeah. So like actually a really similar one is from that game is we have one character who had kind of gotten into like areas of into like their career of smuggling the Jedi post Order 66 because they'd served in the Clone Wars. And they had this love of the Jedi because of that. They had like seen they'd been a part of like that conflict and seen like the Jedi doing some stuff that like inspired them. And so we had a moment of like that character revealing that super early on. And that didn't have a lot of implications in that moment. That was just a character trait of like, oh, they really are like a Jedi fanboy, essentially. And that's the thing that the other characters got to know. And there were some jokes about it, but it was never a thing that had to be visited or tackled. There were some like interesting discussions on people's different views of the Jedi and based on their different backgrounds, but then like it was done. But that laid the groundwork for a lot of moments later on. It laid the moments for like certain character reveals about like which one of them did have ties to Jedi or like meeting Jedi later on and seeding elements of okay, well, who did they specifically know? And the Jedi that they knew at the time coming back and like doing creating fiction in that way, even though it didn't matter for like half a year.
Yeah. Um
Yeah, no, you missed. Vidya says came in at the right moment because he's the player of the force sensitive character who did not know he was force sensitive. You missed talk of your own character, Vidya. I'm sorry. Uh,
oh no. Um oh actually so I guess this would be like a theoretical example because we haven't gotten this far with our character's dynamic yet. But or just so character whose parent is a supervillain. Every time a new hero comes up, it raises the question of what has my parent done to
yeah,
this person, right? And even though we didn't even know that this like character existed until they probably popped up into this moment. But naturally, it's a question you're just always going to be asking because it's just sort of an ever present part of the situation in your life.
yeah, exactly. Uh,
Um, and it's you could say it's like a fountain of eternal plot.
Yeah, exactly. Having bits of backstory like that that are out there means you can always get some interesting dynamics off the bat with any other character based on those aspects of your backstory that the others know.
Yeah. Um, and it could be, and sometimes it's with your character with other characters, with say the Jedi example, or it's your character's relationship with the world around them.
Yeah.
Um, or your group's relationship with the world around them.
Oh yeah. Um,
Like say if your character is a cleric, god stuff. It's always just gonna keep coming up all the time.
yeah. Uh,
Um,
I don't think I have anything to add. I feel like that's a pretty good capping point on
yeah,
that aspect of discussing
I think
backstory.
so. I
Um,
think the main what are the main things we haven't hit on yet? Just the specific like system stuff. Do we want to
yeah. Do
actually get
you,
into that?
want to talk about that for a bit? Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it like that and then go Q&A, right? I think that's pretty
Yeah,
good.
I think there might be one more point that that's on the back of my mind that I'm trying to pull out. But then yeah, and then we can do Q&A
Yeah.
after this.
All right. Well, since you were just on a game design panel, I'll ask you to start this part.
Ooh,
Um, let's talk about systems. Let's like two parts of this.
cool.
Good systems for stoking drama, and how can we take ideas from those systems and just bring them into other games, even if it's not mechanical, but just
Yeah,
like
true,
repackaged story, if
sure.
as you will.
So, since we've been talking about masks a lot, and I think there's a reason we talk about masks a lot, and one is like Morgan and I play a good amount of it, but the other is that it does have a lot, like superhero stories have a lot of backstory elements that interact with the world in a set area, and so it works real well for this. But I want to talk about two specific playbooks from masks. One that I think does the continual emergence of backstory and stoking the flames with it really well, and one that I think fails at it in some pretty heavy ways. Uh,
Interesting.
yeah, I mean, I've spoken about this playbook before, but so like I think Maths has a lot of systems or playbooks that do this well. Harbinger, um,
I love Harbinger so much.
Scion or Legacy, where you have like parental or familial connections or some bond to an established root in the city, and the elements of those connections are constantly emerging. Harbinger does it really well because every session and every time you interact with someone who you think is relevant to the future, you have a specific mechanic for developing the backstory and the drama on the spot. And based on how the roll goes, it can determine whether it's a negative or positive interaction, how much control you have, and how much you cede. And it creates constant fuel for drama and conflict. Uh, and I think that's a really good mechanic that like we can be inspired on for a lot of our stuff. Like if you have a character who has some form of knowledge or connection to an area, whether it be from a backstory element or whether they're from the future or whether they know this place or whether they've been here before, you can constantly be asking questions about what they know, what has changed, what they might think they know, why it's different, things like that.
Yeah.
Uh, a playbook that I think does this weekly, despite being a really common archetype, is the Janus. So I
Okay.
think the reason Janus is your Spider-Man. You have two lives, you have two identities, and you are trying to juggle them. It's a really cool story type, and I enjoy it personally, as mentioned by as noted by the previous Spider-Man references. However, the reason I think mechanically the Janus is weak is because the elements of the Janus that generate drama related to your backstory, A, don't necessarily introduce new elements. They rely on the existing elements, and B, they don't connect to the other players. A lot of the Harbinger story, for example, is creating elements related to the superheroing stuff, in which you're usually going to involve or pull in or be embroiled with the other characters, because that's just how your connections are woven. With the Janus, all of them have to do with your civilian identity. They actively pull you away from the drama, from the fiction. Your backstory is pulling you away from that. I think one of the really interesting things about, to go back to Spider-Man PS4, is that Peter Parker is a mess, and you get a real sense of the degree to which he is a mess. I love the boy, but he does not get have his shit together, and a lot of times that catches up with him. He like is constantly afraid of being evicted and not paying rent in time and losing his job and not juggling his obligations to Aunt May, and his relationship with all his relationships are a mess because he can't juggle things. But he always does the superheroing thing. Those things cause drama and tension that intersect with the superheroing, but ultimately he's always pulled towards the superheroing. This mechanic in the Janus doesn't do that. It pulls you away from the superheroing unless you have a GM who is really good at weaving those together. The mechanic doesn't provide scaffolding for that. And so I think one of the ways where backstory mechanics or building off existing backstory can hamper you is if it pulls you away from the group or from the fiction in a way that doesn't pull others with you.
Yeah, that's a really good point. Um,
Mary Jane, thank you. That's Mary Jane, but also Norman Osborn. That's the kid, and a bunch of other folks.
yeah,
Um,
um, and his
Thinking of them.
job and his boss. Or
Yeah,
no, Jameson's not his boss at that moment. Anyway, forget what I just said. Norman's technically his boss, I guess. But there's yeah, I think like that's really interesting is that like the important note of just making sure that like when you're involving all of this stuff, that you also involve the other characters, right? That's like the real key here is that if it's just you playing your own solo game, like it's good for like for some scenes, but if it's like constantly pulling you away from everyone else, um, it like sometimes takes away from the game, but also because the other people can really shine like sharp relief onto your own problems, and like create interesting dynamics where they relate to your problems differently, and that
yeah,
just becomes interesting tension, or just it, or even just provides you a solution and like a
yeah.
good character arc.
Um, yeah. I don't have more to add. Do you have more you want to add at this point?
Um,
'Cause
I
if not,
think let's look at let's take on the good examples and
yeah.
like
Actually,
and go
I want
there.
I wanted to do a case study real quick for a second.
Ooh, yeah,
I wanted to
I love.
talk about like I think an archetype that gets a lot of shit on it because it can be really hard to pull off is the loner in the corner.
Mhm.
Your Aragon, your lone wanderer type who's moody and wears a dark hood and is usually an chaotic evil rogue if you're playing in a system that uses those distinctions. Um, I want to talk about how being open about the backstory and the elements that bring the character to that point can make that fiction work. I don't know if you got ideas for that.
I mean, let's take the Aragorn example.
Yeah,
Aragorn in the beginning of the story isn't very talkative, but he still offers narrative hooks to the other players in a couple ways, right? Even if he's not necessarily communicating them explicitly, although sometimes he does. One, he gives away that he knows people the other characters know, right? He's not completely antisocial. He knows Gandalf, he knows Bilbo, which are automatically draws the other characters in, and then he involves other people into his backstory by showing them things
yeah,
like, oh, why do you know all of this? Like just being able to like express what he knows and like being a world-wise character already raises questions. Him drawing a broken sword like already like involves other people in the backstory because they like get to know things about him and start wondering about his story and natural curiosity, and then it further snowballs into him talking about being, I guess, the trying to become a king. And I'm just trying to remember how the story goes. Like I think it's like he reveals a song written about him by Bilbo, and like talks about how he's like trying to become a king or unite two kingdoms together, and like those backstory elements get revealed slowly.
yeah.
But it just starts with like him, the the quote unquote player of Aragorn, even though it's
Mm,
not actually a player, inviting the characters in by giving these tidbits without
yeah,
necessarily needing to say them explicitly, by just
yeah.
showing them.
And some of the characters in like if we're talking about like in character in that fiction, while the players might have all known, Gandalf is really the only one who, as a character, knows all the backstory. And even having that one point of connection means that there's a stronger incentive to build up Aragon's story in that case. Uh, by being open, like by the players knowing who this Aragon person is, even if the characters don't, they can lean into that. Gandalf is, yeah, probably a GMPC, but
Yeah. Oh, it has to be a GMPC.
um,
But surprisingly not overpowered because he's not casting that many spells.
yeah.
He just happens to know everything and do everything.
But yeah, like the loner archetype, like you can do a lot of archetypes that are antagonistic, quote unquote, by being open to the players about a why they might be that way, b what you want their arc to be, and how you can work with the others to construct that, right? Because if you just have a loner type who's sitting in the corner and the characters have no reason to connect to them and the players have no reason to know why they're like that, it can be really hard to build a fiction around that.
Yeah. Yeah, you just have to figure out like ways of inviting your character inviting people in like new alternative ways, right? So it can just be your character like the loner and another character get into a fight, but then the loner drops like a reason why, like that's just a part of the backstory, or just them like having like another like NPC come and recognize them, and then that becomes a point of conversation later, right? It's just sort of um there are ways of making it work as long as you figure out how to communicate these things to the other characters in alternative ways, right?
Yeah,
Um, because it can still be antagonistic as long as it's you just have to give like stepping stones and breadcrumbs to get to the next place.
Yeah,
And you make the other players feel comfortable engaging with that stuff. Because
yeah,
if every interaction they have with you isn't fun, then they won't want to. But if it's tense but interesting, then people will want to keep engaging.
yeah. Actually, to give another example from the Star Wars game, one of our characters, the shapeshifter, was a on-the-run Jedi. And he was the loner type because for the last year and a half, he'd been on the run on his own without forming any bonds or connections. Um, and so in any other story, he could have showed up for the group would have dropped him off at whatever planet and moved on. But because the players knew about this backstory, they knew why he was acting that way, and they knew he was another player character, they could work together to lean into revealing just enough about the backstory to make the character stick. And the player himself worked to invite and open up bits of their character to the others while also integrating themselves into the plot so that they couldn't be left behind.
Yeah, that last part's really important.
Yeah.
um, being the important thing is to not be antisocial.
Yeah.
um, Whereas, like, you can be a loner and not get along necessarily, as long as you have reasons to exist in the space and people, and especially engage with the full world and premise of this of your game as it is,
Yeah.
that can help a lot.
Yeah, and like I think being to go back to like the whole theme of our panel, being open about your backstory is a great way to integrate yourself into the plot because by revealing that you've provided hooks, you've provided hooks to
Mhm.
the other players, you've provided hooks to the story, you've provided hooks out of character and in character that integrate you into the plot and show that you're invested in being a part of it, and that can be a great starting off point for developing what comes next.
Yeah. Um, and also, I think one last note about the loner is that, I think this is much more generalizable. Is just when you have a character that like has this sort of dynamic with the group that like isn't always like that's like complicated and tense, right? Um, Always make sure the dynamics evolving. Don't just like leave it static there
Yeah,
because that when it's static and not changing, and like the characters aren't able to like create and affect the dynamic where your relationship with another character isn't influencing you at all or like causing you to be different, that becomes tough. So as long as like you're open to like the other characters like changing things about who you are by just interacting with them, that's like a really good ground to get
yeah.
places even with tough archetypes.
Yeah, and I think the most interesting part about tabletop games is the other humans at the table and the way they can react to the pieces you put out and be enthusiastic and supportive of it will surprise you. Like they can come up with reactions and ideas to feed into it that you could never have dreamed of, and that's where a lot of this cool fiction comes from, in my opinion.
Hmm.
All right,
I
unless you have
think
anything else to add, do you want to do the Q&A?
I think this is Q&A time. Yeah.
Awesome. So at this point, we will take in any questions we have from the chat. Give folks a couple minutes start throwing some in. If no one throws them in, I will start rambling about random things to give people time.
Yeah, I don't know what the delay is on the stream, but
It's at
hopefully
least
not.
20 seconds or so, I think. But um, I mean, okay. Do you have something you want to add, or take a quick sip of water? Give people a minute.
Mhm. I didn't want to say anything because my mouth was filled with water, unfortunately.
That's super fair. Um, okay. I mean, one of the things I like to ramble about of an example of like having backstory, uh, creating some.
Oh, do we have a
Let's
question
see. There's
now?
hold on. Yeah, there's something going. If you can, yeah. So like just talk in the chat about creating external reasons for characters to stick around each other, even if they don't like each other. That helps. Um, that is 100% true. Like sometimes, especially if your group isn't as comfortable playing with conflict or uncertain spaces, having a forcing a holding environment, aka some situation which brings them in contact with one another to keep them there while the relationships develop can be really useful.
Yeah. Um, Especially like external goals, and they can be really simple, just like like money or a common enemy or something like that can at least keep everyone together for them to first bond, even if the bond isn't necessarily, oh, you're best friends. Um,
Uh,
yeah, but
yeah.
you got something?
Yeah, we got a question.
Ooh.
So when making a backstory, and this is by Imani, when making a backstory with a team, how do you balance not making your character OP because it's fun, in terms of like giving them too many backgrounds, too many connections, whatnot? Do you have?
Oh, how to oh, is it like the too much connection to everyone
Yeah,
kind of thing? Okay. Um, I think there's a couple ways you go about doing this. Um, I think one of them is establishing the potential for connections, but not necessarily spelling out what they are. Is a really
mm,
easy one where it's uh, your character has a reason to at least care about the other characters,
mm,
and know about them in some way, but not necessarily having oh, I know exactly my history with you yet. Because then that becomes like an invite for the other person to like add things. And when you're both sharing the backstory, that helps decenter it around you and like makes it more of a shared thing, right?
yeah,
That's one really good way of helping, as long as making other people become involved either in session zero or leaving there to be space for other people to put um, unique things into your backstory.
so to add, do you have more? Or
Oh, no, you go first,
Okay.
and we'll
Yeah.
do
So to add
go.
to that, like I think there's a very fun story that's out there on the internet that a lot of folks are familiar with. The story of Old Man Henderson. It is a old story from the depths of the internet back in the early thousands, and so there's a lot of parts of it that are do not great. So I don't recommend reading it, but it's a funny story because it's a story of like a GM who had been causing conflict with their players and like being excessively adversarial, and so one of the players went home, wrote a giant backstory, and showed up to the session and used the backstory to justify all sorts of behaviors and getting around any obstacle the GM put up. Yeah, it's a very old story. It's very funny, even if it hasn't aged perfectly in a lot of ways. But the thing about the old man Henderson story is it's interesting because like it's about a GM and a player being in conflict. But the thing about the old man Henderson story is if you and your group want that to be the case, you totally can be. There are games that are designed for you to have characters with all these connections and interesting backstories that allow them to get away with so much. And if you and your group are trying to play characters with a lot less of that, then that's perfectly fine too. The key to that is just mostly knowing what the scope of your characters is expected to be. Are they expected to know everyone in town, or are they expected to have no interactions with anyone before this moment?
Yeah, I think another thing to just add as a more general set of advice is
Yeah.
making sure that when you're creating relationships between people, like so with the old man Henderson story, those backstory things only get invoked to the character's advantage, right? They're
Mm,
like things that like make you better, make you more powerful, make you more capable of doing something in the story, right? But to like tamp down on the OP-ness, it's good to have the give and take of
yeah.
backstories. So if you know someone, it's not always a good thing, right? It could be, oh, I did something bad to this person. So say I am a Jedi, like you over there, you maybe are upset with about me because my master did something bad to you in the past, or
Yeah.
like someone that I or like a friend of mine, that kind of thing. Whereas someone your Jedi fanboy will have like a more positive relationship to you,
Yeah.
and like making sure to include both of those can help
Yeah.
balance things out, as long as you don't do it too much and make the story only about you.
Yeah. Yeah. And that, I mean, that's kind of the core of it, right? Like, don't. I mean, as long as you are not overshadowing everyone else, then it's fine. Uh,
I think I want to take the
mm.
Def's first and second question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Characters. So, question is, what about creating characters without traumatic or amazing backstory? I feel like there can be an overemphasis on backstory instead of current story. I think that's a really good question.
Yeah. Did you have an answer to that since you were so eager to ask it, or?
Yeah, I think the thing with creating like a character is you don't necessarily need to have an elaborate, like fantastical like situation or bad situation you have to overcome, right? Really, to make a character that's functional, you just need to have like a reason to be there and a goal that your character wants to achieve, right? Usually you want more just because it's fun to have more, but if you have those two things, it's usually enough. Um, and those are probably more important than like having a well built out backstory because you can discover that later, or you can um, figure that stuff, or you can figure it out as you play.
Uh,
I think there's more to also say, but I will let you take the
yeah.
reins first.
The first character I ever played in a campaign was a beacon and masks. Beacons are your happy-go-lucky, no power type character, and he had nothing tragic about his backstory. His backstory consisted of having skills he'd honed with a trampoline in his backyard and like martial arts class he'd went to as a kid. Um, that was all I had, and he was a hero because he had the habit of showing up to places at the right time to like get involved with a crime and stop it. That was it. That's all I had for the character going into the session. Nothing in that was sad or tragic, and he went through some shit later on because the tragedy emerged for play.
Yeah.
You looked like you were
Um,
gonna weigh in.
yeah, like just to add to that is that especially when you have a character that like is relatively normal, in the sense of they don't necessarily have they're not a famous son of a famous son or anything like specific like that, is that just um giving them aspirations like helps like a big deal. Like with a beacon, like they aspire to be a hero, and they really want to do something, and the drive to become like
Yeah,
bigger or better can be really interesting, especially when you don't have that much else to say because you now understand like why this person might want to do something. Or you can also say like they kind of just are lacking stuff, and it's not because they're they had some great tragedy where their village got burned down. They just were born poor and that's it.
yeah,
And that can just be fine because like having just like that simple seed can be like a really powerful motivation for a character. And just to go, you can take that a lot of different places, even though it like seems really simple. You
mhm,
can justify a whole lot of different things that a character will do.
yeah,
Um, just being like, oh, I don't want to have to worry about like either like powerful people messing with my life or being
yeah,
ruined by like not having money to do things. Um, any of and you can go a lot of places with just like lacking
yeah.
basics,
Yep.
even if you're not famous or renowned or tragically created.
Yeah. And like ultimately, like you might not even play a game with any tragedy at all. Like not every game needs to have tragedy or heavy emotional beats if that's not what your group wants. Like especially if you're playing a game like and blanking on like
Golden
games right
Sky
now.
Stories.
Yeah, good Golden Sky Stories, which is a great question for or game question. I'm blurring words here. It's a great game for like telling fun animal stories. That doesn't really necessarily have to have any tragedy. It's just a fun time.
Yeah,
Uh,
and
mm,
like and even with like something like that, the you lacking something can be really simple, right? You just, oh, I'm lonely,
yeah,
and I want the like
yeah,
I want to fall in love, and like that can be like already like it's
yeah,
not dramatic, but like everyone like understands that and like
yeah.
can go places with like that kind of story, and
I think
that was good.
I think the key for that as well, just to be like the key when you're being open about tragedy is you're being open about the plot hooks you've put in your backstory. And so if you're creating a character without tragedy, just be open about the areas you want the character to explore. One of the things that the Beacon has as a playbook is drives, which are four things they are working towards accomplishing. And so by being open, like one thing you could do is if you wanted is you could just have the drives on your paper and never talk to anyone about what they are and try to accomplish them yourselves. But my character, immediately one of their drives was come up with a hero name because he didn't have one. And so half of the session was spent with the other players just making bad jokes about what his hero name could be. And that was a lot of fun and led to some actually a really cool narrative moment where he claimed the hero name. Uh, because all the other people were able to build it up by me saying, hey, that's a thing he was looking for. Nothing tragic about it. It was just really fun.
Yeah,
Um, so
let's
move on to
let's
yeah.
yeah. The next question, I think Fiditia had a
Yeah,
question.
Viditya asked the question about we don't know if you talked about this, but advice, thoughts, tips on linking character backstories together. So we have talked about it a little. I mean, the biggest one is obviously, as we mentioned earlier, work, do it through the table together. But I'm curious if you have any like specific advice or tools beyond talk communicating for that.
Um, So I think advice in general is, I think I said this in the last panel too, but from the GMing side, is like follow your curiosity about other characters. Um, is just like when people bring up things that are interesting to you, like engage with them and interact with them, right? And it could be in the session zero of like they bring up an interesting backstory moment, like, oh, like I can see a space for me to be involved in this. Are you okay with me like being like this? Or it could be when the character brings it up in session two, you're like, oh, what's that? And like you like be just show interest and like get involved. And maybe you it then raises questions of like, why are you so interested in?
Mhm.
And then it can be like the platform to emergently create new character backstory and depth to you, and you find out something new about your character just by what you're interested
Yeah. Also, like, if to piggyback off a point there, like asking for consent to be included in their backstory is a great approach. The other is for asking for volunteers. You could be
in.
like sitting here and like you're making a character who perhaps has some really deep elements connected to either their family or a specific sibling, or not. Be like, hey, does anyone want to be like foster siblings or something like that? You can ask for specific volunteers to fit in to categories, or you can try to volunteer yourself and be perfectly acceptable if someone says, "No, I'd rather not have you fit in this position," or "No one is cool with being in that position." That's fine. Be willing
Mhm.
to accept that and move on, or be flexible about it.
Yeah. Um, and I think another technique to add some that sometimes people don't always do is like it sometimes is okay just to be 2 degrees of separation from someone. That there is an NPC, you are linked to another person because you both know
Yes.
someone else.
Yeah.
Especially if your relationship to this someone else is different between each of you.
Yeah.
That can be create really interesting
Um,
backstory connections.
in general, I would say like it's a lot stronger for you to have NPCs if at least there are 2 points of connection to the NPC. Having an NPC where one person's connected to them means they might not come up at all or tension isn't as much there. But if you have at least two people with different connections to the NPC, you've instantly created a more whole dynamic with it.
Hmm.
Because you've created a relationship triangle essentially, but
Yeah.
that isn't like an awkward love triangle.
Yeah, it's the classic PC NPC PC triangle of apocalypse world.
Exactly. And with that, like that's a great way to just create points of connection and points of tension and points of drama. Like as I mentioned earlier, in when I was talking about how me and another character in the Pokemon game constructed scenes between our characters based around our unique views of a core figure to both our backstories,
Mhm.
and that worked out really well.
Yeah. Should we go
Um,
to Monty's question?
yeah, let's go to Money's second question, which is, what game has your favorite character creation tool?
Oh, it's gonna be hard. I have to think about it.
I'm gonna
You
brag
go
about one of
first.
my own games for a second, because I can, because
You
no one can
should
stop me. Uh,
do it.
so Dream at High Noon is a game I wrote that is a poker-based game, and I really like it because the character creation system is you draw one card from every suit, and that's the entire character creation system. Because each card gives you a signature weapon, gives you a passive ability and active ability, and your Constitution modifier, and those give you a full way to look at what your character can do and how they interact with different parts of the world. And then there's some structure as well for that I'm blanking on because I haven't looked at it for like fleshing out the remaining details. And there's some tables in the back you can use to draw and inspire your character. So I think that's a really neat way of building a character. But that's just me.
Ooh. Um, I'm not sure. I have to think. There's like a lot of interesting ones. I have to think
Yeah,
of one that stands out as my favorite. Oh, okay. Um, I'll have one weird answer and one
yeah.
practical answer. So practical answer is I wish I remember the details better, but I really love Bolt's character creation actually.
Hmm.
Um Specifically because it works on like all the like a couple different levels of um that it's like still pretty like lean, but it has like okay, here are your different backgrounds and they give you certain things. And also here's like a couple hooks that your
Yeah,
character has, and it kind of gives you all the tools
yeah.
you need to like create a forward facing character, even if the things aren't concrete, which is actually
Yeah.
pretty good for like my own style of like you can feel it gives you hooks to like do something within
Hmm.
play. And then the weirder answer is I wish I've written the second edition, but I haven't yet. But the first edition Delver is really interesting
Hmm.
because of the weird approach it takes to character creation, where you don't it's not traditional in any sense of oh like there's no like rolling for backstories or like
Yeah.
lists to do or like prepackaged like tropes to work from. Usually a lot of what it is are just a bunch of like loaded, metaphorically like dense like things that your character possesses.
Yeah.
And like I always think that those are like really cool prompts because it'll just be like um I wish I could think of a good example off the top of my head, but I remember playing it once and just hearing like uh a shepherd master's cloak or something weird like
Mm.
that, where it's not spelled out what that is, but getting you to think about what that could be is like a really great imaginative prompt for like creating a character.
Yeah. Um, and to go in the entirely opposite direction, For the Queen is a game which has no character creation, but you end up with really strong characters. And the way it does that is you start play like every round of plays, you're answering a prompt from a card, and you don't do any prep before the game. The only prep is you choose a artwork for the Queen. Your character is non-existent and only emerges from the answers you give to the questions. And I think that's a really good example of how your backstory can be developed through playing out the events of the game.
Oh, for the queen is a really good answer. I
Yeah.
didn't even consider. Oh,
Yeah.
I wish I
Uh,
said that. That's good. I know people have like shouted out Dread, but I haven't read Dreads. Because it has like a whole
yeah, I
questionnaire
haven't
thing.
looked at this either.
I
Yeah.
do want to. And then the last one that I wish I had a good example of, because I don't like how Burning Wheel does it, but Life Path character creation systems are just in concept really cool to me. Um, because they're like, oh, what's like your history? Like, here are the different paths you went through in life. And like here's you went from being like this like child of a farmer to being a
Yeah.
blacksmith to being a soldier like drafted into war and like having the like your life arc
Yeah.
spelled out in like that kind of way is really cool. The only reason I don't like Burning Wheels is that
Yeah.
it requires a book this or this thick to
Yeah.
be able to parse out all of those options, and
Mhm.
that's a lot of that's a
Uh,
too big
yeah.
an ask.
As a final note before we move to the next question, I also sometimes just like enjoy having a crunchy system. Amani mentioned Pathfinder 1E. I also enjoy just like sitting down at like with the PFSRD and going, okay, how can I make this specific character with all the options available to me? Lancer is another fun system for making characters in. I also really like doing that with Genesis or Star Wars RPG and being like, I want to make a character who can do this really obscenely specific skill. How do I optimize them for that? That's fun. It's not
Mm,
necessarily as great for like building a character for play, but it actually can be because like from there you can go, okay, I have this character who's really optimized at shooting with sniper rifles to the point where they can shoot a pilot out of a TIE fighter. How did they get here? Why do they have the skill set? What did they develop it for? And from there you can do some really cool stuff. Um, to answer one last question or two before we wrap up, Adam asked briefly, how do you build character backstory in the middle of play and relating it to the current arc? Mostly, I just do that by finding hooks where there's interesting moments for drama to be created, where there's bits of my backstory that are missing, or where interesting questions are asked of me, and I could answer it with an in the moment answer, or I could give it more depth with a backstory.
mm,
Um,
yeah, like there's um and there's also like ways to do like once removed things to make it relevant. So even if your backstory isn't relevant plot wise to the situation, you can still feel invested in the situation because of how it relates to you. So like an example of this be like, oh, if your character lost a family member, even if that loss in itself isn't relevant to the story situation, you
yeah,
can it makes a ton of sense for your character to become invested when like another character's parent is in danger.
yeah,
And you bringing that up as like you justifying like why you're helping and use it and like leveraging that
yeah,
to get yourself involved in that story can be useful even if it's not like quote
yeah,
unquote plot relevant. It
yeah,
becomes like a cool character moment for you,
yeah.
and also like relates you to like someone else's story and allows you to be like
Yeah.
interested in supporting them.
All right. Adam has one last question, which I think is a nice wrapping up question for the panel before we do our outro plugs, which is what is your favorite backstory you've seen either from yourself or someone you played with?
So many. How to narrow it down?
Hmm.
You got one?
I need to think from one, but I don't want to stick to someone to one of our own unless like one that you've played that really stands out. But let's
Uh,
just to make it our choice a bit easier, stick to one of our own.
let's. Okay, character with interesting backstory.
Yeah. What's your favorite character's backstory that you've had?
Man, hardly write them out. It's hard because like there's the answer. So how do we want to answer this? Do we want to answer it as the backstory I came in with, or the backstory I ended up with after playing this
Ooh,
character for a
do you have
while?
2 separate answers? Because if so, I would love them.
I think so,
Okay, why
because
don't you hit us with them?
so for the backstory my character ended up with
Mhm.
is like the character from the future who I came in with like just the premise I dropped in, like the first scene of the Trunks premise, right? That's it.
Yeah.
But I'm still playing this character because pull them out every so often. But just so long down the line, they just have so much that's like been built out about them. Um, and part of
Yeah.
it is stuff that's emergent, but like some of it is just we pulled out a game to just play out the like last um moments between them and their like actual mother from the
Yeah.
future in like a flashback scene, and we like kind of spelt out their whole family history and how they got to know them, how my character is not actually like is just adopted, and was actually the child of a supervillain just like their
Mm.
adoptive mother, and they got adopted out of that situation, and how the relationship was really complicated. And
Mm.
then also how like that person, I end up being connected to several other characters, like with like their positions in the
Yeah.
future of, oh, here's this person who's like my surrogate dad in the future, who I'm now like partners with founding another organization,
Yeah.
because like I want to support you, and stuff like that that keeps happening. Also, they technically ended up time traveling 6 times because time travel shenanigans.
Nice.
That was
What about the
fun.
favorite one you came in with?
Whew, that one I need to think about. I have to think. Come back to me.
Okay, so let me go with the favorite one, or one of the favorite ones where it ended up. So I have a character who was a Star Wars character, and he was a gunslinger smuggler type, and he was like Han Solo-y in personality. And so I brought in, the basics in the game. He did freelance work for a hut, and that was about it. That's all I had like going in, and also some strong family connections in his backstory, and that like most of the work he did was so that he could keep his family safe and keep sending like money and resources back to them. That was his motivation for acting. During the course of play, we started discovering more about his personality and the types of, and like we explored some of the jobs he'd done in the past and how like, and enemies that he created because of that. But the most interesting one was like we it became obvious that like he'd flirt and seduce his way around, and so being a person like a character who was really has a really strong sense of family, and that was a really important thing to him. One of the things that came out during play that he had not known about was that he had a kid that he hadn't known about, and the kid was like five
Mm.
years old by the time he met him. And so that created a really interesting character moment for him coming to terms with that, and then like reacting and dealing with that moving forward, even though he didn't have that backstory bit going into play. All right. So favorite backstory came in with. You got your answer?
Yeah, I have probably two that could work. Let's go with the one that's probably easier to explain.
Sure.
Even though it's weird. um, so I had a character. Actually, no, you ran for this character. My Nephilium, and half angel. Uh, 1 second, you cough. Doop, doop, doop. Uh, Basically, this character, I like started out with the premise of like, or two premises basically. The first was um being raised Catholic. I've got and no longer being Catholic. A lot of stuff not to work through, but like stuff like running through the back of my brain that I don't really get an outlet for, even though it's like was a part of my life.
Hmm.
Um, and so I was like, okay, character who's like um Nephilium, which is basically in biblical lore, you are the child of uh, a normal human and an angel.
Mm.
Basically, everyone or a lot of people they existed pre-biblical floods, and then afterward were theoretically gone, which makes it weird this character exists in a modern setting,
Hmm.
which we haven't gotten to explaining yet. And then the second part is me being biracial, having using that as like a lens to just talk about that in a way that's like less intense, but still able to explore some of the dynamics of it.
Yeah.
Um, but this character is from a like got brought to heaven and raised by angels, and basically became the legacy hero to the equivalent of a Wonder Woman in the setting, who is an angel who like uh came from heaven and it was just like serving as part of the local Justice League
Yeah.
and brought me with you as like as like the ward and the reason I like this character's backstory so much is there's a lot of like stuff that like comes up because I created like her main antagonist who comes up a lot, who is just another a fallen angel.
Okay.
I have the backstory with the other legacies of the other three pillars of the Justice
Hmm.
League. So your Batman XP and your I guess more your it's complicated,
Right.
and then
But
you're like the child of Superman as well,
yeah.
um, and like also bringing in all the heaven stuff of like, oh, I interact with all these other like angels all the time because
Right.
it's just interesting too and it's fun. And so I just like that because there's just as it's built, there's so much potential for just things to come up that are interesting
Hmm.
because of how they relate to like all these important figures in the world. That is just so much fun to play them.
Yep. Awesome. So for my answer, it's also a Masks Legacy character. They're one actually. If you are curious about them, you can go listen to them on the Protein City podcast. They are a part of a legacy of Egyptian heroes, or I should say, three Egyptian heroes and one white British dude. Uh, and the whole point of the legacy is that you have these characters who are all tied directly to Egyptian mythology, and there's this British archaeologist who is also there, and it's about the character took the mantle directly from the British archaeologist and is dealing with a lot of tension of like trying to live up to the reputation of being a big hero and being part of this line, while also having this grumpy old white British dude glaring down at them the entire time, as well as other elements of conflict in the backstory because the team itself had broken apart because of actions and behaviors mostly by that same British dude, causing more like generational conflict between members of the team. So that was pretty neat.
Oh, I love
I'm
Jade
pretty
Scarab
proud
so
of
much.
that. Yeah, Jade Scarab is very good, in my opinion. But yeah, with that, let's do plugs and outros. Morgan, you want to go ahead?
Yeah, let's quick thing about plugs. We've got um
Yeah,
I am a game designer who publishes some games on itch. You can find my games at nestedgames.itch.io. And if you have the Racial Justice itch bundle, you can find my game there called A Long Night in the Mech Bay, which is can be a good tool for tragic backstories, I guess. But it's just like talking a game about playing relationships and just complicated relationships and how they all hash out over time when you're embedded in this really tense situation, like say a war. You can also find my Twitter at magpie_mirror.
yeah,
And I have one more panel for Gen Con Online on Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time called our Failing Forward, which will be focused more on the GMing side of things and how to um, not make failure be the stop tier play and how to keep rolling forward with more and more interesting story. How about
yeah.
you?
So I am Ammourazz. You can find me on Twitter at Ammourazz, which is the Amari. I put it in first. You can find it on Twitter at Ammourazz, which is the hub to find the but most the rest of my stuff. You can hear my voice on a bunch of podcasts. I mentioned Mr. Fears, that one episode of Protein City. If you're interested by this character, if you want to hear the Pokemon character, the last season of playtest, and just a bunch of other random guest appearances you can find. I also design games like the Dream at High Noon poker game that I described earlier, which is on my itch. And link to that is just h.io/Ammourazz or also on my Twitter. I'm also going to be on a panel tomorrow morning at an ungodly early hour, talking about keeping a live game dev log journal. And I believe that's on Margaret Catcher TV Twitch channel, if I'm correct.
What
Other than
time
that,
is that panel?
what is it?
What time is that panel?
9 Eastern or 6 a.m. Imani time.
Ooh, oh no.
Yeah. Um, so to do the plugs for some other stuff, this Utopia crew, specifically Miriam, who is our producer, along with B, Sin, Brido, and Drac, will be on, I believe it's the Magic and Mischief game happening on the official Gen Con Twitch TV channel at also at 10 a.m. EST, so at a slightly more godly hour than our panel. So if you can catch our panel, then go watch a game or sleep and go watch a game. I completely understand that, but
Mhm.
feel free to buy if you haven't already acquired a free badge, get that and give a ticket. It would be great to give a ticket for our panel, but it's especially important to give a ticket for their game since that is going to be on the official Gen Con TV TV Twitch channel, and that means the metrics matter more. Other than that, we will be doing a raid of Kupo's Twitch channel. So I will
Oh,
leave that to Miriam to handle. Thank you all so much for sticking through with us, and have a wonderful evening.
thanks, everyone. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for Miriam for producing.